I'm Mangino. Welcome to the Mangino Talks Pittsburgh podcast. We talk about everything that matters to us all, from current events to Pittsburgh history, social issues to sports, politics, to practical day-to-day life. And today, politics and practical day-to-day life, current events, it all comes together in a story regarding the release of a study that was a year in the making, $180,000 in its total cost by an organization out of San Francisco that says that we have the proper number of police officers budgeted for the city. And at that top line, you say, okay, great. Then that means we're on the right track, right? Well, no, it does not. We are far from being on the right track. I'm not even sure we are on any track at this point when it comes to police in Pittsburgh. And here's the reason why. The headline in the Post-Gazette, Pittsburgh has enough cops but should move some patrol officers to other units. The issue of having enough officers budgeted is a completely irrelevant number because we don't have that number of police officers. It's not even close. Not even close. As of Wednesday, there were 792 officers. 792. If you go back to the beginning of the year, January 1st, we were around 835 officers. At the 1st of February, we fell down to around 818. And the numbers dropped even more to get us ultimately down to 792. Now, there's an argument that's being made. Well, we do have a couple of recruiting classes that we're looking at. Monday, there will be a new recruiting class, 30 new trainees, and then coming up in November, sometime up to 40 recruits, according to the new police chief. And that'll be nice. The problem, though, is it takes considerable time to get these new trainees trained and then have the ability to be on the force independently and not be chaperoned by somebody else. It's kind of like a student teaching position they're going to have for quite some time. They're not going to be cut loose on their own. They're going to have to be with somebody to be trained on the call, on the streets, if you will. The concern, though, too, is that we have dozens of police officers that are near retirement age. Some people have put the number upwards of 100, 150. We're also losing police officers on a regular basis, not only to retirement, where they just resign. They're done. Some of them saying, you know what, I'm going to go find something else to do than policing. Others are going to the suburbs, and they're getting better pay and a lot less stress, right? And I'm guessing to some extent, not only the stress levels of what you deal with day to day, also the grief that you get on a regular basis as a police officer in the city, not appreciated, not respected, the risks of being shot at, the likelihood of having some serious injury to you, where if you go and you work in the suburbs, it's more peaceful, it's more relaxing, it's safer, and you get to make more money in the process. So no surprise that we're losing police officers in both ways. People who are just aging out and it's time to retire, and then those that are saying it's time to move on and do something else. When you look at this study and what they're assessing, this idea that the 900 is enough, we need to figure out ways of reallocating the police officers. And that's something that the chief even went along with. He said the staffing levels that we have aren't in crisis. The current staffing that we have keeps the city very safe on a daily basis. Now, I'm going to ask each and every one of you that live in this city, do you believe that our police staffing is at a crisis? If we're budgeted for 900 and we have nowhere near 900 police officers, and we're going to be losing more as every day goes by, and we're not replenishing them nearly fast enough, and then you hear all the reports of the crime that's taking place, the shootings that are occurring, the violence downtown on the south side, are you buying what the chief is saying and that the current staffing that we have keeps the city very safe on a daily basis? Well, if that's the case, then we don't need 900 officers, or what we really need are 800 officers. We don't need 900. To what extent the chief is doing nothing more than carrying the water for the mayor's office. We'll continue to explore in this episode. We go on to look at this, and he says that this study provides the foundation for how he'll move the Bureau forward, and that this blueprint is a recommendation, it's not a directive. Now, I realize that when you talk off the cuff, that you may interpose words, and looking back, you may decide, maybe that word wasn't the best word. And I'm going to focus for a moment on this issue of blueprint. Anybody who knows anything about blueprints knows that when you build something, you build to the blueprint. There is no variance on this. You build to it. If you're not going to build to the blueprint, you better go back to those that came up with the blueprints so that you can then make those alterations with structural integrity. Blueprints are not guidelines. They're not recommendations. Blueprint to build a house. Blueprint to build a car. You build it to that specification. That's how you do it. So he says it's a recommendation, not a directive. If that's the case, then it's not a blueprint. He says it gives him the ability to allocate resources in an appropriate manner. The study also provides an outside perspective on how things are done at Pittsburgh Police. And I'll go along with the idea of an outside perspective. And isn't that why we hired him as chief? Because he was from here, went outside of here, and is coming back, and he's bringing back that perspective. Bob Swartzwelder, the president of the local police union, said that the study, he's not all that thrilled. He's not impressed. Here's the quote. Either this study is invalid or command is severely mismanaging its police force. If we're properly staffed, why are officers routinely being compelled for overtime? That's a fantastic point. It's one or the other. Either the study is wrong or we've had complete incompetence in managing police resources. Now, what you have to ask yourself, though, is that if we haven't been properly allocating officers, that means we have too many officers in some communities and too few in others, why you happen to have mandated overtime. Now, you now have to ask yourself, if you live in a community inside the city that has Pittsburgh Police patrols, how many of you believe that you have too many police officers in your community? And that how many of you are comfortable with the idea of having fewer police officers in your community? There's no disputing that there are areas that clearly need so many more, like on the South Side. But to go back and argue to people and say, listen, we're pulling some of the officers away from your community because you just have too many. And we're reallocating our resources. And so you're not going to have the police presence that you otherwise had that gave you the level of comfort that you currently have with policing and safety. We're diminishing that. I'm not quite sure where they're coming from on all of this. Bob Swartzwelder said that in a recent time period, Tuesday to Wednesday, just this week, 22 officers were held for mandatory overtime. Can you imagine what that's like? You go to work, you put in your time, and you're getting closer to the end of your shift, and all of a sudden you find out you're mandated to work a double. I think that we are putting a greater burden on police officers than can be reasonably expected when you compel them to have to work 12, 14, 16 hours a day. One of the things that's popular right now is this idea of having a proper work-life balance. I want to be able to go to work. I want to do the job. I love this career that I have, but I don't want to live it every waking hour of the day. I have a spouse. I have children. I have families. I have hobbies. I have other things in my life I want to be able to do. You can't continue to mandate all of this overtime and then expect officers to stay, especially when they can make the same amount of money working a straight shift and be in one of the suburbs instead. The chief says that the reason why we're having this mandated overtime is because we don't have our resources allocated in the appropriate places. The study also suggests that there are several opportunities for jobs being done by officers to be performed instead by civilians. And the chief says when he talks about civilianization, it's not in place of our officers, it's to complement our officers. Listen, it's in place of officers. It's in place of. Because if you have the proper budget for 900 officers, and they're providing the service that is genuinely needed at 900, you don't need civilians to then take on those positions. Because when you look at the size of the police department that you need, you look at every aspect of it, from those who walk the streets, patrol cars, ride the horses, motorcycles, and then all of the administrative aspect of it as well back at headquarters and police stations. If you're going to say that we want civilians to take the jobs that police officers have now in the offices, then you're not looking at supplementing police officers, you're looking at replacing police officers. Not a compliment. And then there's also this push around the country, and this is something that's really important too. Around the country, there have been greater calls for non-police officer response. Out in California, there are a whole host of calls that you would think you can call 911 for and then get a police officer to show up. They don't even bother sending the police officers any longer. They send somebody else. It's civilians taking police officers' jobs. Now, we can argue and discuss back and forth as to, does it make sense to pay a civilian at a lower wage than a police officer to do a job that can be easily done, effectively done as a non-police officer? Have the discussion, but let's have it honestly. We are genuinely talking about replacing police officers. The same thing applied to the military. We subcontracted out many jobs that members of the military once had because we only had so many members of the military coming in, so many recruits that were coming in every year. So then we decided, okay, well, we have to focus on ultimately what's most important here. And what's most important is having battle-readied the support aspect to soldiers. Maybe we can subcontract a lot of that out. And we're dealing with the same thing when it comes to what's happening right now with police officers around the country. They also talk about time spent when it comes to policing, how they're actually using that time. And part of the study looked at police response times and ranked the Bureau as exceptional. That when it comes to getting the phone call, the police show up, exceptional. That's the line. And ultimately, for those of you who have had to call to wait for the police to show up, how exceptional is it? I know of one young lady. It wasn't an emergency call, but it was a call that required police presence. It was over a damaged vehicle, and they waited hours for a police officer to show up. I'm not quite sure that falls into the category of exceptional. They also measured proactive time, or the time that officers are not responding to calls. The agencies typically strive for 40% proactive time. Pittsburgh's based on data from 2021, 71%, indicating exceptionally high levels of service. So this study says that when it comes to proactive policing, the Pittsburgh Police absolutely off the charts, doing an amazing job at proactive policing. In fact, they go on to say that it's so high that they're not confident that there's an appreciable value gain from all of this additional coverage, which is pretty remarkable. How do you have a short-staffed police department by about 100 or so officers and then have all of this free time to be a proactive police officer and then deal with the crime rate, the violent crime that is permeating throughout much of the city? I just don't get that. I just don't. When it comes to community-oriented policing, one of the things I'm on board with the chief about is that this is not something that you designate a few officers to do, that ultimately every officer needs to view themselves as a community-oriented police officer. He said in a quote, "I am of the belief that all 900 men and women are community-oriented police officers. But we don't have 900. We have less than 800, but they all should be that." Because their ability to communicate and to have the public be cooperative in efforts to have a trust, to create those bonds, that's critically important, not just for a certain division within the police department, but everybody in the police department. In the officer survey portion of the report, about 85% of the more than 560 officers interviewed said that they either disagreed or strongly disagreed with the statement, quote, "We have sufficient proactive time available to address problems in the community." Now, how is it that 85% of the officers can disagree that they have sufficient time to be proactive when this study comes back and says that they have an exceptionally high amount of time? Excessively high is how they describe it. Doesn't really make sense that the study's authors are experiencing such a radical disconnect from where the police officers actually are. 60% of the officers interviewed either disagreed or strongly disagreed that their schedules allowed for an adequate work-life balance. No surprise, considering that you have all this mandated overtime. How could you possibly have an adequate work-life balance? The report also recommends for how many patrol officers each of the department's 6 zones should have. All of the zone recommendations include a reduction in officers from current staffing levels. That's according to Bob Swartzwelder, once again, the head of the union. All of the zone recommendations include reductions? All of them? Downtown, reduce. South Side, reduce. Are you kidding me? All of these other communities as well? That's just absolutely nuts. Beth Pittenger, the executive director of the Citizen Police Review Board, said, "I would be hesitant to decrease the number of officers assigned to the zones because people complain that there aren't enough officers as it is. How could you possibly?" And she's right. How could you possibly reduce that number? When you look at what's happening on the South Side, the co-owner of the Carson City Saloon on East Carson Street temporarily closed because of the violence. Before the pandemic, there used to be upwards of 30 cops patrolling the South Side in nearby areas. And before last weekend, when the city and the Allegheny County Sheriff's Office boosted patrols, they said that they consistently saw as few as 4 or 5 officers on the South Side. And apparently, according to this study, that's too many. Zone 3, which includes the South Side, currently has 59 officers assigned to it, and the study suggested lowering that number to 49. That according to, once again, union head Bob Swartzwelder. The chief saying that whether the city would follow those recommendations is still a matter of discussion, and part of it is based upon call volumes, but not the crimes the calls were made for. And that's a really good point, too. If you have in one community, people who are calling because cat's up a tree, and that's the predominant call, and there's a lot of cats in the neighborhood, does that mean you need more police officers there? Where in another neighborhood you have fewer calls, but they're calling about, armed robberies and rapes and murders. You just can't go based upon just a sheer number of calls coming through. It takes a whole lot more than that. How these people conducting this study weren't aware of that, I have no idea. Also in this story from the Post-Gazette, Ms. Pittenger said that she was concerned about some of the recommendations, like removing patrol officers. But what really stuck out to her was the lack of community involvement. It's purely data analysis, and it certainly has a value, but I think it has to be coupled with community expectations and community feedback. So ultimately, there's a lot to look at here. And I've also been notified that there has been a considerable shakeup in the police department, that the assistant chiefs that were in place are no longer in place. They've promoted different individuals to be assistant chiefs, which then begs this question. Why wasn't this something that was prominently discussed, where the chief has new assistants? And it's all part of this ongoing effort to change and reform and improve policing. Isn't that something that you would tout, right? Wouldn't that something that you would shout from the rooftops, that we're coming up with a better plan, a different plan, a way of addressing this in a more creative way, and you can have confidence in what we're doing? But instead, they do something and they do it on the down low. It's secret. Well, why is it secret? Are you ashamed of these promotions? This administration continues to show itself to be ill-equipped to handle the times that we are facing. They don't do a really good job when it comes to getting in a position to take care of issues, Instead of being proactive in their policing and in their policies and in their mindset, they are extremely reactive. And now the mayor is wanting to control messaging that gets out. And ultimately, what he has in mind is his own reelection bid. But at the same time, when you are trying to centralize that level of influence and power and take away authorities and abilities to communicate from others, you're not putting this community collectively in a better position. You're putting it in a worse one. And we need to continue the vigilance in monitoring this administration and what it's doing, not only in policing, in public works of all kinds. And now that there is this attempt to try to corral and contain communications, a greater need for investigative reporting, greater levels of probes, not just talking with the mayor's office and his official spokespeople that just tout the line, but to find those that can really provide the residents of Pittsburgh and the visitors of Pittsburgh the information that they desperately need and ultimately deserve as well. Thank you very much for listening to the Mangino Talks podcast. Please be sure to click the subscribe button so you don't miss an episode. For more on me and the show, be sure to visit manginotalks.com. If there's a topic that you would like me to talk about or a guest that you would like me to have on, send me an email, mangino@manginotalks. Follow me on your favorite social media platform by using @manginotalks. And once you find me, please like, follow, subscribe, and share the pages with your friends and your family. And thanks once again for listening to the Mangino Talks podcast.